is going to proceed. Also, the panel have been asked to answer 2 questions. And the first question is, which ideas, framework, or theories have had a major impact in our field and why? Now, for this question, each panelist will take turns and have approximately 5 minutes to answer the question. And I will indicate when the 5 minutes have passed, but I'm trying not to be too rude to the panelists because I don't want to do that. The second question is, which ideas, framework, theories should we carry forward to the future, and why is this important? So for this second question, we will have more a self-organizing discussion, and we will run this discussion until we end out of time. Now, I see that Jean doesn't hear anything, so if anyone could help her out, maybe. So we really need her to be part of this panel and to hear what is going on. So let me start by asking Peter to introduce Warner, and when he's done that, Warner can go on to answer the first question before introducing then Jean. So please, Peter, first.
Now, in a way, I have been given the most complex task of the session, and in a way, the simplest. Why the most complex? Because I understand I have 30 seconds, 60 seconds to introduce Warner. That is an impossibility. But at the same time, it's a very simple task because if you are in the field of organization development, of course, you know Warner, all right? But if you are not in the field or new to the field and you would like to know more about Warner, I would like to give you a reference. And that is the Palgrave Handbook of Organizational Change Thinkers. And it is in that volume that we have a bio which was done by Deborah K. Newmark. So nobody knows his bio better than Deborah. So I'm going to use Deborah to do the introduction. And here is what she writes. W. Warner Burke is a consummate psychologist and vital contribution to the field of organization development and change. For over 50 years, he has been a thought leader and a dedicated steward of the profession. He was often the first in key organizational roles, forging new professional territory as an architect of institutions and programs. Leadership, self-awareness, organization change, and learning agility are the center of his academic work. A leader in the field, he has been recognized throughout his career with numerous honors and awards for his scholarship and practice in organization development and change. And then she ends by saying that this bio, that chapter, substantiates the enduring values and relationships, institutions and thoughts, enduring work, legacy, and unfinished business of W. Warner Burke, learner, leader, and scholar practitioner. Okay, learner, leader, and scholar practitioner, it's all yours, Warner.
And with that, 25 cents will get you the entire thing. Anyway, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, Deborah, for writing what you did way back. So I appreciate this opportunity. I want to just say 2 things, really, and I'm not sure I'm addressing the questions precisely, but bear with me. The second question was something about frameworks for the future and theory and things of that nature. My answer to that question is very simple. It's all about the Berkeleyan model, for God's sake. So just follow the model. That's the future. Now, with respect to the other part, I'd like to address the past and the future, just very briefly. That's the title of our session in any case. What's the interesting thing about the past is that there was a hub, to use David's word earlier, that was in Washington, D.C., where the National Training Laboratories was located, and the OD network. And then Wendell French, in early 1970s, at the Academy of Management in Atlanta, was the initiator for the OD division and asked me to come and work with him and so forth and join forces, which I did. That was an exciting time, by the way, for the birth of the division and so forth. And what was true in the past starting in the 1960s was there was a hub in Washington, D.C., as I said, and then there were what we might call cells, C-E-L-L, all over the country, East, Midwest, and West, and coordinated by two divisions, the OD network and the OD division of the Academy. And so there was kind of in parallel, these two divisions. Now, what was interesting about all that in the early days was how much academia was involved with respect to the OD network. So, for example, just some quick points about this. From the beginning, we were linked with academia, Washington, D.C. being the hub. And these cells were across the United States. In the East, the cells were focused in Boston, and that was MIT, Harvard, BU, and BC. BU, Boston University, and Boston College. In the West, the primary location was UCLA, and that was like people like Warren Schmidt and Chuck Ferguson and so forth. And in the Midwest, which was Cleveland and Case Western Reserve and Benedictine outside of Chicago, where Peter Sorensen still carries on ridiculously, but he does. In any case, after all these years. So these cells.
Okay, Warner, I said, let that go. Warner, you're my model, okay? You're my model.
Right. So these cells interacted with one another, and the point was that we were academically based as well as practice-based. That has gone away. We have a greater separation today than ever before. Do any of us belong to the OD network? I no longer do. But am I involved with the OD division of the Academy of Management? Yes, I'm here today. So the academic part of OD and the practice part of OD is very separated. That's not to say that both don't contribute to thinking on both sides. So I think we must move more in an integrated way in the future with respect to academia and practice. And that's through the process of evidence-based operation. So if I wanted to introduce Jean Bartulik, which I'm about to do, those words would be her personified. Jean, for my money, she's at Boston College and has been for her entire life, I think. In any case, it probably feels that way to you, Jean. In any case, what I want to say about you is that you have led the way to help us to understand how to use evidence-based work to support our work in the field of OD. You're the premier person about that, and there ought to be an award for that from the Academy for you in terms of the evidence-based person, the distinguished scholar of evidence-based work. That's you, Jean. Take over.
Warner, you are incredibly kind. And I feel lucky, following you is impossible, but I feel lucky to be going after you. So when I was looking at the schedule, I was noticing that we are the legacy folks and then come the future. And some of the future people are the same age as the legacy folks. So it got kind of annoyed. So I decided to be something annoying in turn. So I decided that it would be appropriate to start with one very brief thing. I hope I can get this to work right. Let's see. Oh man. Just a second. I just run into technical difficulties. Okay. This clearly isn't going to work. I've had all kinds of problems with hearing things this morning. So what I'm just going to say instead is this would have been, well, let's see if this works now. Okay, so with that in mind, in case anybody didn't hear the words, the importance of what I'm saying is that everything old is new again. And as I mentioned, I felt kind of a bit annoyed when I discovered that some of the people talking about the future are the same age as those of us talking about the past. So I decided to, okay, if I'm going to do that, I'm only going to talk about theories or frameworks that are at least 70 years old, that have had a major impact on our field. And I'm just going to briefly mention 4 of them. And when to the extent that I know it, they evolved. The first is action research, which started with John Collier's work in 1945, Kurt Lewin's in 1946. It has gone through many, many iterations since then. Some carried out by some folks who are on this call now, including Bill Torbert, for example, being kept alive by Hillary Bradbury and others that, to the best of my knowledge, is not talked about in management schools, but it is talked about in other venues. Then, of course, the 1947 Kurt Lewin's unfreeze change freeze model, which is still the model that a lot of people outside of OD think is exactly what we're saying about how change happens. And Bernard has written about that recently. Many others have written about it recently. It's going to stay regardless of whatever critique it gets. Then in 1948, they were writing about force field issues. Koch and French wrote about resistance to change. That has clearly taken on a life of its own and is continuing in all kinds of new ways ever since, but that has always, since 1948, given the impression that the change agent is right and others are wrong. And then finally in 1951, this is the last one I'll talk about, the longwall method of coal mining, which has led into all kinds of work on socio-technical systems. It has ended up influencing things like Search Conference and Future Search and several other of large group interventions that focus on structures as well as people. So I'm sure there are others. These were the only ones that I could think of that were at least 70 years old. But I think they do give an illustration of they're old, but they're new again. They keep being reinvented in ways that are sometimes a bit of a surprise to somebody else. So I think that's all I need to say, but if anybody else could think of anything else that's at least 70 years old that could influence us, I think it's worth it to add it in. Now, though, I would just like to introduce Bob Marshak, and it's an honor for me to do this. Bob is a friend, and he has been for many years. I think the world of him as a person, as well as as a contributor to our field and beyond it. I first heard of his work, I think it was 1993, from Linda Putnam, who's an organizational communication scholar, who was talking about the work he did about Confucian approaches to change. And one of the things that we all owe him a lot for, is that he saved jabs. Jabs has needed to be saved on multiple occasions, as Warner knows very well, but Bob was the first person in my acquaintance who took the journal when all of a sudden it had lost a lot, and not only propped it up, but improved it, so that it is more and more now becoming a really highly influential, again, journal. Bob has also written a lot about covert processes in organizations. He's one of the, to my mind, one of the foremost contributors to that. He has been very involved in developing, with Jervis Bush, dialogic methods of organization development and building on that, generative change models that have taken some of the old things that I mentioned and refocused them and shown how they can be acted on in a brand new light. He's currently the Distinguished Scholar in Residence Emeritus at the School of Public Affairs at American University. But that is one way of describing his job, but it has never been an adequate way of describing his contributions. And Bob, I just want to say that for me, I think you're not only part of OD's past, I think you're part of OD's present and future too. And I'm really grateful for everything that you continue to contribute. So thank you.
Bob, are you out of words, or do you want to continue?
No, I was actually waiting to be unmuted. Jean, thank you for that very kind and effusive introduction. My goodness, I'm here kind of taking it in and trying to grok it all. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. When we were asked to think about this, I kind of went back and I did my version in my head a little sloppily of what Jean did and thought about it. But what came to my mind were not some of those theories that I think we're familiar with and we'll discuss this morning. What really struck me as the most important idea is the idea that human beings matter, that human beings can make a contribution, that people can advance society, can advance organizations, and to have a positive view of free will, a positive view of democracy, a positive view of opportunity. I think sometimes we describe and communicate that OD is a post-World War II adventure, and we'll talk some of the things around it. I'm not sure how much people really get the dire straits that the world was in the 1930s going into the 1940s, how much that influenced the social sciences, at least our kind, and how at one time it was a matter of question whether or not democracy was the best way to go versus fascism, authoritarianism, and that OD emerged out of a tradition that said it matters, people matter, freedom matters, and holding up that beacon at all different times where people want to come up with other points of view. And it comes to my mind because I think as a world and as a society, we are once again facing down questions about whether or not democratic ways of life versus authoritarian ways of life are better. And that this idea that permeates everything in OD and is in one way kind of a contribution of us standing up against some of the economists with a different view and holding that down with theories and practices and ways of operating. I think that's probably the greatest legacy I can think of, and the most important one probably going further. And back in 1971, that's 50 years ago, if I do my math right, I was a sergeant in the United States Army. I think we all know what was going on at that time. Shortly thereafter is when I started my graduate studies in organization development. And I read what was then a classic, is now a classic. I'm not sure people read it anymore, but Chester Bernard's Function of the Executive. And he ends that book in a very philosophical and moving way. And I'm going to read you a quote from it, hopefully quickly. That is it's probably the most impactful quote I ever read, and it's the one I always remember. And I used to, when I was teaching my courses on organization theory and other things, I always ended with this. So here it goes. This is on page 296, the very end, the last paragraph of the book. Such a story calls finally for a declaration of faith. I believe in the power of the cooperation of men of free will to make men free to cooperate, that only as they choose to work together can they achieve the fullness of personal development, that only as each accepts the responsibility for choice can they enter into that communion of men from which arise the higher purposes of individual and cooperative behavior alike. I believe that the expansion of cooperation and the development of the individual are mutually dependent realities, and that a due proportion or balance between them is a necessary condition of human welfare. Because it is subjective with respect both to a society as a whole and to the individual, what this proportion is, I believe science cannot answer. It is a question for philosophy and religion. And I think that's picked up by what we do, and I think we are the carriers of that, and I think that is a lasting kind of legacy from my point of view. I'd like to now introduce Bernard Burns. I'm not sure I saw Bernard on the screenshots, but let me introduce him, and I'll add my own personal comments about him in a moment. He's a professor of organization change at Sterling Management School. He is a longtime contributor in our field. He has written his book on organization change, is Managing Change, is now in its 7th edition. It's a kind of a standard textbook everywhere. He's written a wide variety of articles, books, chapters, and whatever else. And I think one of the things he's probably most known for, and certainly from my point of view is most known for, is a sense of the history of organization change and the field of organization development and of NTL Institute. I'm a longtime member of NTL. I'm emeritus there as well. And so I have always found reading anything that Bernard writes educates me to the reality of the field. I think we live in a field that nowadays that the students that come through, and I think many of the practitioners, live in a world of myth. Lewin is mythologized, the era was mythologized. There's no real sense of what really happened, what the choices really were, what went into kinds of things. And I've read Bernard's work, which gives me kind of a pulling back the screen to what was going on and a greater depth to what was happening. And I commend anybody in the field and anybody in this division to probably read anything he's written that has to do with the history. I'm serious, Bernard. The history of the field, Lewin's contributions, and things like that. And it's funny. It's like his most recent, I believe it's your most recent article in Jabs on the origins of the three-step model, Lewin's three-step model of change, and which is very educational. But if you go into Jabs, you'll discover that not only is it a powerful article, but it has been viewed and downloaded 23,000 times. I'll let you all grok that one for a moment. And what I think that was published, 2-3 years ago. So God knows what it will be in the future. Bernard, it's all yours, and nice to see you, and welcome.
Okay, am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those very kind words, Bob. And can I just say what a privilege it is to be on a panel with 3 other such distinguished people who I have always admired and looked up to. So this is really a very good day for me. what I thought I'd do in terms of looking at that first question is just, in a sense, to say how I came to Lewin and why I think Lewin's important. And I first discovered, or it came to my attention, Lewin came to my attention in the early 1980s when I was doing my PhD. And so you read these things about Lewin, and often at that time they're saying, well, Lewin's rubbish. He's very simplistic. He's out of date. He's all about stability. We're all about change. Forget about Lewin. And I thought, well, who is this Lewin guy? And what you've got to remember is, of course, in the early 1980s, we don't have Google, so we can't Google Lewin. We don't have email, so you can't email anybody and say, who is this Lewin character? So basically, all you've got is what's in your library. And over the years from then, I sort of built up my knowledge of Lewin. And I particularly thought of those two recurring criticisms of Lewin. One is, he's all about stability. So in an unstable world, he's no good. And he's very simplistic. So what do you find when you look at Lewin? Well, Lewin's born in 1890 in Germany. He's a Jew. And being a Jew in Germany at that time is not a pleasant experience. And it gets worse and it gets worse. He fights in the First World War. He lives through the revolution in Germany, which overthrew the Kaiser. He lives through hyperinflation in Germany in the 20s. He lives through the Depression. He moves to America. There's the build up to the Second World War. There's the Holocaust in which he loses family, including his mother. And you think to yourself, this doesn't sound to me like a guy who would produce a model which is all about stability. So I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind. You know, what when you see criticisms of a person, do they align with a person? So there is that aspect of it. What about being simplistic? Well, for most of his career, apart from maybe the last year, Lewin was a child psychologist. That's what he was paid to do. He's a child psychologist in Germany. And what he's doing in the 1920s, he's looking at child development. And child development is a very complex issue. And Lewin becomes an internationally recognized scholar in it. So, you know, he's not dealing in simplistic concept. But what he is looking at is how children transition from one development stage to another. So, you know, they're crawling and then they're toddlers, etc. And he's saying, well, okay, for a while, their behavior is stable. He uses this wonderful phrase, quasi-stable equilibrium. And sometimes when people ask how I am today, I say, I'm in a quasi-stable equilibrium. What this is about is field theory and understanding the context in which children are developing. Then he's looking at how children move from one development stage to another. Then he's looking at how they settle into that development stage. And if you like, how the new development, new behavior freezes. But he's also interested in why children move at different ages. He's also interested why some children find it difficult to move at all, and why some children, once they've moved, fall back. And in a sense, you begin when you read that to understand where unfreezing, moving, and freezing comes from. It doesn't come from a simplistic concept. It comes from human behavior. When Lewin left Germany in 1933 with the rise of Hitler, a very smart thing to do, he moves basically to Iowa, the Child Welfare Research Station, and continues to be a child psychologist. But he's also developing his work outside of organization, outside of the university, outside of child psychology, and looking at social groupings in their broadest sense. And so he's interested in things to do with racism, religion, all sorts of discrimination. He's very keen, very passionate about the need for democracy, both within society and in our organization. So what you find, and what I found once I got into Lewin, is what he wants to do is say, why do we behave as we are? When we behave in a bad way, why do we do that? What can we do to undo that? So behavior is stable. We know this. You know, if ever you've ever tried, and I say this to my students, if ever you try to diet, you'll know exactly how stable behavior is. But what holds that behavior stable? What are the forces? Can we understand the forces? And if we understand those forces, can we change the forces and help people to move? So what role do social groups play in this? What role do peer groups in this? And Lewin comes up with this wonderful thing, which says, actually, if you want to change a person's behavior, you have to change the behavior of their group. He also understands that to change behavior, people have to be willing to change their behavior. It's the old joke about psychologists, isn't it? How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb's got to want to change. So he comes up with this idea of choice, felt need, that we've got to do this. And so underpinning all these things are people have to be involved, people have to participate, people have to have choices in their life. People have to, in a sense, be democratic beings. And so what he comes to at the end of the 1930s is involved in how do we resolve social conflict? Because what he sees around him in the world is social conflict. And he's mainly involved in this outside of organizations. He gets involved with Alfred Marrow's Arwood Manufacturing Corporation and does an enormous amount of great work there. But his passion is resolving social conflicts in society. In 1945, he sets up two very important groups: the Research Center for Group Dynamics at MIT, which then moves to Michigan after he died, and the Commission on Community Interrelations, which is really about resolving social conflict between races, between religions, etc. Unfortunately, just as he gets to the stage where he's, in a sense, broadened out from child psychology, he's got to the stage now where he's actually being able to be paid to do what he wants to do. He dies. So does that mean Lewin's work ends there? Why has it been picked up? And in case why it being picked up, I will quote to you Ed Schein. And Ed Schein says, all organization problems are fundamentally problems involving human interactions and processes. If we want to change organizations, if we want to improve organizations, it is about behavior. How can we change behavior? And what Lewin says is very simple. We can change behavior only when people want to change behavior. So that's my contribution to the first question. Now, can I introduce Peter Sorensen? I have to say that Peter Sorensen is somebody who I greatly admire. He's a pioneer in the field of OD. He's a great scholar practitioner. And the idea of being able to study and do is something I admire greatly. And anybody who's been given an outstanding OD Consultant of the Year award by the OD Institute is somebody we should all admire. And when I was asked to do this, I thought, well, I know a lot about Peter's work on, for instance, global OD. Let me have a look at some of his earlier work. So I went back to what I think is your first paper in 1969. And this was about power and control and authority in organizations. And he's written quite a lot in the 70s about important stuff. In the 80s, what you see is Peter starts talking about different types of change. So quality circles, for example, job redesign. He also looks at different types of approaches, particularly appreciative inquiry. And then he moves into a field which I think is tremendous and I use quite a lot. And this is his work on global OD. How is OD expanded out from the US into the rest of the world? How is it changed as it's expanded? What role do national cultures play in this? And what can we all learn from how OD develops in other countries? And this is a tremendous contribution to the field. But his contribution doesn't stop there, because at Benedictine, he starts this wonderful program, an MSc in OB, and he's training, educating, teaching the OD practitioners of the future. So he's not just saying, this is how we should do it. He's actually training people to do it. He's helping people to do it. And I think this is a tremendous contribution to the area. And it really is an honor and a privilege both to introduce him, but to be on the same platform as him. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you so much. You know, we are so, oh, Christy, I've got a question for you. Since this is being taped, can I play that testimonial for my class? I would really appreciate that, okay?
I think you should say it many times.
Okay.
Put it on your CV.
Oh, yeah, well, listen, I'm self-conscious enough. I mean, you have to put me on the big screen. Listen, all right, so we're celebrating our 50th, right? And the 50th celebration, I think part of that is memories. And I would like to borrow Warner.
Peter, could you get a bit closer to the microphone, because
Yes,
I can't hear
okay.
you very well.
All right.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. The problem is I got two mics going and they go back and forth. So sometimes I have to move to the left, sometimes I have to move to the right. But now you can't see me, which is even better. Okay, so I'd like to borrow Warren for just a minute or two. And I'd like to take Warren back to a day in May. It was a Saturday. It was a beautiful day. And it was, the year was 2002.
We're losing you again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Not very well.
There seems to
Hear me
be a,
now?
Peter,
Hear me
there seems to be a setting that has to do with sensitivity and volume. So if you can just speak up a little bit, it seems that we can hear you. It's when it goes lower that we seem to lose you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I'm taking Warner back 20 years to a session at Benedict. It was part of the lecture series, and it was Warner and Robert Blake. And I remember that morning when we introduced Robert Blake. Robert got up and drew the managerial grid. And in the back is that last drawing of that session of the managerial grid by Robert Blake. 2 years later, we lost Robert. And perhaps this is the last grid that was drawn by Robert. In fact, it was signed by him. So, in a very serious way, I would just like to say to Warner that his work, I think, is an incredible testimonial to one part of Robert Blake. That was Robert Blake as an educator, and the role that Robert played in that relationship with Warner Burr.
Peter, when you speak softer, we're all losing you, unfortunately.
Oh, you're probably fortunate. Okay, so am I doing better now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Gene, keep on nodding and smiling. Okay, it helps me out. All right. So I have a confession to make. When we first started to talk about this session, I thought we were talking about next year. All right. So I'll put together a few notes. We have paid recognition to Kurt Lewin. And what I'd like to do is just take a minute to say that I would agree with Kurt Lewin, and his work is very personal to me because I was 6 years old when the Germans invaded Denmark. And as a kid, I heard stories about a relative who died in a Nazi concentration camp because he was a Danish policeman. And the Danish policeman helped the discriminated who escaped to Sweden. And I heard stories of how some of our other relatives served as a safe house for people moving from Denmark to Sweden. So it was in that context that I became familiar with the writings of Lewin. And then later, I had a chance to study and do a film on his works with the Boys Club that reaffirmed and created the sense of values which characterize the field of organization development. And I think that those values were extended to an organizational level by Litwin and Springer and their study at Harvard of British balance and blazer. But I don't think that he reached a wide audience. I think that wider audience became dependent on the work of Robert Blake and Jack Boutin. All right, it became dependent on McGregor and McGregor's work on Theory X and Theory Y. More recently, I would like to acknowledge the work of David Cooperrider and Appreciative Inquiry, because for me, that is a continued reflection of the fundamental values on which the field of OD is based. Again, a reminder of the work of Douglas McGregor. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of Bob G. Bob Kolumbusky, because Bob writes about the paradox of OD. How hard we have been on ourselves as a field, when in fact, if you take a look at the documentation provided by Bob G, we have been, as a field, incredibly successful. Another person that I'd like to acknowledge is Larry Greiner, because I think that his concept of evolution and revolution was an important contribution. And finally, I would like to acknowledge Henri Saval, one of the exceptional scholars in Europe. And for, close to 20 years now, the OD division has been visiting Lyon, France. Have been co-sponsors of a conference in Lyon. We've had a chance to become familiar with the French knight by the name of Henri Saval. So, those are my thoughts on the foundation and some of the more important contributors to our field. And thank you for letting me be part of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you all panelists for sharing what you found most important of the history. And thank you also for introducing your esteemed colleague. I think instead of me doing that, you made it really much more lively and fascinating and enlightening for all of us. And also, I think all of your thoughts about and reflections about the past reveal that what we need as scholars is to go back and revisit the important frameworks or theories and look at it and read it carefully, not just cite somebody who has cited, but also look at it in their context, in the context they were writing it and understanding it. So thank you for sharing that. Now I want to turn into the second question. And for the second question, we're going to have a more of a self-organizing discussion. And just to remind you what the second question is, it's also which ideas, framework or theories should we carry forward to the future? And why is this important? So, and now it's just to take yourself into discussion, and there's no turns this time. So who wants to go first?
I don't mind saying something if that's okay.
All right, very good.
One of the things I think we have to recognize is that the tectonic plates on which we've been standing for the last 50 or 60 years, which are often described as neoliberalism, are changing and changing dramatically. And we have to, we as an organization, we as a group of people, we have to recognize what that change is about. And I often think about the UN's approach to these things when it talks about the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. For the last 50 or 60 years, for good or bad, in our work with organizations, we have had to look at organizational effectiveness in a very narrow way. We're now going to have to look at it in a much broader way. How is this organization going to work with its local communities? How does it affect it? How is this organization affecting the planet? How do they need to change? How do they need to behave differently? And there is this wonderful concept that's been developed called a social license to operate, meaning that if organizations are to exist, and anybody in Europe, and particularly who knows about Shell, may well know something about it, if an organization is going to have permission to exist, it's got to come to a common cause with community groups, with NGOs, etc., in order to save the planet. And it also means that we, as an area, as a group, have to look at our approaches, our tools, our techniques, and say, how many of these will stand the test of moving into a post-neoliberal era? And how many of them are too narrowly based on organization effectiveness as a profit? So I think there's big challenges out there. But I think I really do. I'm an optimist, and I really do. If you look at the talent available to us, if you look at the people coming through, we can deal with these things. We have a massive role to play. But we have to, and this is a terrible thing for change people to accept, we have to accept that we also have significant changes to make as individuals, as groups, as practitioners.
I think it's a very good reminder. Jane.
That, first of all, Bernard, that is really provocative and important. And one of the things that it reminds me of is that we've all been talking about things that happened a really long time ago. Years ago, and I think Warner was the Journal of Consulting Psychology or something like that. You said something like, nothing really new has happened in OD since 1987. And I might have the year sort of wrong, but I think that's right. I think it was with appreciative inquiry. But one of
have it right.
Yeah, okay. One of the themes that I didn't put in because I was wanted to talk about things from the 40s. It was also in the 1970s that people started to say that OD is dead. It was being replaced then by quality of working life. And that has been a constant theme, really a constant theme ever since. So I think one of the challenges is, so this is not exactly an answer to your question, but Bernard didn't exactly answer it either. But I think is one of the things we should not keep is the idea that we're dead, and instead have broader aspirations about the world we're in and that we're trying to create. That I'm hearing Bob, Bernard, Peter, Warner all talk about. There's something bigger that we're part of, and Bernard talked about it particularly right now with regard to the UN development goals. I think that's what you're referring to, and some other stuff too. What do we do to contribute to what really matters in the world and stop saying that we suck?
All right, who wants to go next?
Okay, listen, I would just like to add to those previous comments. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge Bob there, okay? Because I was just reading through some of his stuff, dialogic organization development, and I think Edgar Schein in the preface or the introduction has it right. He says that dialogic arrived just in time, all right? And dialogic, I think, takes the history. I mean, I keep on seeing McGregor in Robert's work. I see theory X and theory Y. I see appreciative inquiry, and I see it moving into the future. Now, one of the persons that has not been, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Jade. Keep on smiling. All right, so one of the names I have not heard yet was Gert Hofstede. And I think that Gert made a real important contribution when he started to talk about national culture and national cultural values. Not only that, but I think a guy by the name of Jaeger with a J comes along, and what he does is he takes Hofstede and he starts to take a look at national cultural values and their relationship to organization development. I think that was really an important start. And I think if we had a better understanding of the role that national cultural values play in terms of our role as ODers. But not only that, because I think we're making important inroads in understanding the role of national cultural values. I'm not so sure we are making the same progress in understanding the political environment in which we are working. And what is our role in, do we have a role in different political environments? And just recently, we were asked to invite some of our students to participate in a new OD session in Lebanon, that there was a role for OD in Lebanon. And I think that that's where our future lies, and that is globally a better understanding of what we're doing in different national cultures.
Thank you, Peter. Warner, do you want to comment as well?
Well, just two things. One is that I think dialogic OD is probably counter to what I was saying, that no new aspects of OD have come along. So since 1987. And also the second challenge that I've had is from Kim Cameron, who's arguing that positive psychology should be classified as new and overriding what I have said. And I accept both of those, by the way. And so I give up. Some good things have happened. So, and I want to go along and support and acknowledge what others are saying about that.
All right. Bob, do you want to comment as well?
I can't hear you. Bob, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm off mute now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a lot of different thoughts. Certainly share everything that everybody has said as I think about going forward. The theme for me is, I think the field is, in some ways, has been so successful, and there have been so many different people who have been bringing in different ideas, that it's so fragmented in many ways, and it's hard to get your arms around what exactly is OD. And so you move from a division created by academics who are also advocates of a certain way of being, and they are practitioners. And so in their persona, they are integrating practice, scholarship, academic contribution, whatever else. Now we've split that off. The field has now got hundreds, thousands of practitioners who are not necessarily academics, and lots of academics, of course, who are not practitioners. And the division in the Academy of Management goes from being a place to introduce ideas into management, and a place for people with a practitioner orientation to be a division, to now be a division that worries about whether it's academically credible and whether or not we're doing enough research and enough publications and enough whatever. So we're struggling in some ways to reintegrate what had once been integrated by the essence of the people there. And I think that's a big challenge for us. It's a wonderful opportunity because there's a richness. I often tell people there's a cornucopia of possibilities and theories and opportunities and whatever else. The dilemma of that is you can't eat it all. It's hard to put your arms around it. And we need people to, I think, kind of reconceptualize how we think about things, not necessarily to change what we've been doing so much, but to put them together and think about them in different contexts. So when Peter talks about the world he's talking about, how do we go from ideas that were once mostly practiced in small groups to now not only in large groups, but large international groups, and not just cross-cultural, but multicultural, and where there are some very, very deep fundamental differences in the philosophy of humanity and whatever. And again, I think how we hold on to our core values and philosophical values, I think is the most important thing to take forward into the future.
Well,
that's a big dump, wasn't it?
Thank
I'll go
you
back
all.
to muting myself.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge that we also have a large audience. And Richard, I wondered, is there anything in the chat you want to post to the panel?
There's only been one question that's been posted in the chat, and I think it's going to be directed to Bernard. Was Lewin's work influenced by the Hitler Youth? Their behaviors were astonishing at the time.
The answer to that is I don't know. What I do know that is if you like, approach to life, his general beliefs were shaped by the way he was brought up, where he lived, and the fact he lived in a country where Jews were under threat all the time, whether it be from the Hitler Youth or other people. And as I said, you know, his family experienced the Holocaust. His mother died in the Holocaust. These surely influenced him and his belief in democracy. Though what I would say about Lewin is, if I'd have been Lewin, I would have been incredibly bitter about that. And he wasn't. He was incredibly positive. It fired him on to say, we can build a better world. We can create more democratic institutions. We can move forward. And I think that's a wonderful attitude from anybody in that situation. So I don't know what the Hitler Youth did, or I presume, you know, the general threats from the Hitler Youth, the brown shirts and racism, anti-Semitism, all round influenced his behavior. But, you know, as I said, what I take from it is that he came out of that as a good human being, a positive human being, and not somebody who could so easily have been bitter about it. And also, and this is quite important, he saw emancipation, he saw democracy applying to everybody. There's a phrase which I think Alfred Marrow quotes in his biography, and it goes something like this, Lewin saying, you know, we Jews will look after ourselves, we can do that, but it is important that we make bridges with everybody else and we join together to tackle the problems of society. And that still holds good for today. If different groups unite, they can make things happen. If they fight against each other, those things don't happen. And whilst not wishing to be political in any way, shape or form, I've always liked the saying that some politicians use, if you get people to ask the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about the answers. And what we've got to do is get people to ask the right questions.
Richard, I see that the chat is now moving on.
Yeah, the chat is now.
Do you want to pose another question?
I'm gonna make some people happy, other people not so happy, because we're gonna have to triage the questions. What do you think about a wider conception of organization development to something like trans organization development, or a way to signal a move to broader issues that a few of you have discussed? And this reminds me of, I think Slocum wrote a seminal piece about intra-organization development. So, thoughts?
I think Bob wants to. Yeah.
I didn't quite catch that. Could I hear that again?
What do you think about a wider conception of organization development to something like trans organization development, or a way to signal a move to a broader issues?
I think that's an important thing for us to think about, but it runs into some historic dilemmas and challenges in the sense that an awful lot of the creation of what we do is focused on the small group. In fact, Lewin's original research was very much on you change the small group, not the individual or the broader. That's kind of disappeared with a run into the large group. And so I think there's a challenge for us to think about what are our theories and methodologies, and what in fact is our audience and challenge. Certainly there's a lot of people that want to move beyond, and this has been going on for probably 20 years, beyond the focus on the organization network, trans organization. And we're now in a world where the nature of the problems that are present for us, climate change, pandemics, are so far beyond the thought of the small group and so far beyond the thought of an organization. And I think we are challenged to come up with a change methodology of how do you change the planet? How do you change socio-political, for-profit, not-for-profit networks? How do you get people to put themselves in the game? And whether we call ourselves trans organization development or whatever, I'm not so sure that's important to us. It might be important to other people as we advertise, but I think what's important to us is to figure out what are our technologies, what are our values, and what is it that we stand for? Not everybody has to be there, but what does the field stand for? And I'm reminded by something that was just said, that I think the field of organization development has attracted people who want to fight to create a better planet, who want to fight to create better circumstances, who want to fight and create a world where there's greater positive. And people may consider that to be naive or too optimistic. But I think sometimes people forget our role is to fight those dilemmas, and we will not always be appreciated. We will not always win, but we have to be holders of a beacon of an ideal and ideals as we go out in ourselves, but also when we interact with other people. So I think the question of should we change our name to Trans Organization Development or something, I think the naming of it is important, but it's less important than the changing our will to begin to think of ourselves that way and start contributing ideas and experiences that way, which, by the way, are already going on in many places, but we don't necessarily own it. We don't necessarily bring it into what we're doing because it's a little bit beyond where we are. So my hope is that somehow we don't lose that going forward, and somehow we're able to conceptualize who we are and what we do in a much broader context. And I think we're lagging behind the practitioners who are out there struggling with it, and we have not actually researched it or talked about it as much. Thank you for inviting me in on that.
Thank you. So, Richard, did you want to take another question, or do you want to?
We're going to take one final question because the next session starts in 10 minutes, but we want to give everybody a chance to at least get up away from their screen for 5 to 7 minutes. So the question is, what would be an equivalent challenge today? And they're comparing this to, you know, the time with fascism, World War II crisis of the early OD times, that would now provide a greater context for future or further developments of the field of OD. And I chose this question because it leads us next into our panel discussion about the future. So again, what is an equivalent challenge today that would create further developments in the field of OD?
Can I make a quick comment?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
You hear me? Okay. I'm going back to the earlier question. On my lap, I have a text, Organization Development Change, by the Edgar Hughes. All right. So that goes back a while. I open it up. There is no reference to global OD. All right. So I put that down and I put on my lap the last edition of Anderson. All right. Organization development, the process of leading organizational change. And what do I find? The last paragraph is entitled Global Issues in Organization Development. So I think as a field, we are getting there.
Could I give a quick response to the last question, which is a project I'm involved in with a couple of the people here that Ed Schein initiated, and that is in the kind of global issues that are going on, say, like take a pandemic, for example, or climate change. One of the issues that's really important is that social scientists are not being involved. Yet, Bill Gates wrote this huge book about why the climate change is catastrophic. But I think that one of the things that's drawing us is how do people relate to each other? How do countries relate to each other? How do groups relate to each other? And if there is going to be an adequate response, social scientists, and that includes OD people in particular, need to be able to work with developing ways that people can collaborate without killing each other. And that is I think that is a huge opportunity for our field. It's something that is truly global on many, many dimensions. It's not always one country versus another country and so forth, but it is a truly global need to which we are uniquely qualified to respond. But we haven't, for the most part, we haven't thought systemically about how to do that. And developing new ways of doing that, I think, is really crucial. And that's a switch to the future or present. Well, it's pretty present, actually.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jean.
And could I thank the panel, Richard?
Oh, yes.
And
That's what I was going to ask you to do.
yes, and thank you all for your very insightful and also thought-provoking contributions. And you also remind us that we do have a higher purpose and that our field is highly relevant to fulfill that purpose. So then that's the end of our session. And it's over to you, Richard.
So thank you, everybody. I thank the panelists and especially thank Christine for putting together this panel and the structure of it. We are going to take a 5-minute break and we will come back for the future panel at 8:30. That will be moderated by Jill Payne. Thank you all.
1 second, all please. There is one request from Jill. If you are going on break, to have a look at, I'm going to put a quick link into the chat for you. There's one question that this next session is going to review. And so I'm asking you, maybe as you come back from your break, to answer the one question that is linked in the Google form that I'm going to put in the chat for you all. So if you have a moment to click on that link and answer that question as you return from break, that would be much appreciated.
And Teo, is it possible to put the link in the chat as well?
That's where it is in the chat.
Perfect. Fantastic.
Yep.